You know what really grinds my gears? Other than beginning to talk to you while I'm muted, more than other things that grind my gears, this tweet right here, right? This insane, fully bodied neo-Nazi lady tells us that Yagoda, right, who's the new neo-Nazi boogeyman, in case you aren't forced to pay attention to these morons like I am, killed 60 million white Christians in the Holodomor because actually the Bolsheviks were all secretly Jewish. And you know them Jewishes, they can break the laws of physics and do impossible things just because they love killing non-Jewishes. Like, example, in 1932, when they killed the entire country of Ukraine, which had a population of 44 million people, then casted a magical spell to invent 16 million people more to kill just because, right? I mean, do you know how incredibly stupid this is? You can literally debunk this nonsense with a Google search. Seriously, think about how dumb someone has to be to believe that. How outside of reality and obsessed with labeling everyone Jewish or not Jewish that they have to be, right? They first have to already believe that there is some secret Jewish plot to kill all the non-Jewishes, and that simply being Jewish is the problem, which is possibly the dumbest belief in magic and wizards and Dungeons and Dragons nonsense that I've ever heard. Somehow, being Jewish just magically controls what they do. How stupid can you be? But that's not even the end of it, right? You then have to believe that the Bolsheviks were all secretly Jewish because of this Yagoda guy being Jewish and being a bad guy. And by the way, on the topic of Yagoda, these dum-dums act like he's representative of the communist movement when the Bolsheviks literally executed him for treason and conspiracy, not to mention Trotskyism, right? Which is synonymous with anti-communism. And let's not forget theft, because when they arrested him, they found a bunch of jewels and other stuff at his house. So obviously, what the guy did was illegal and against the state and the entire project of communism. But somehow, these dum-dums fail to mention all that. Wonder why, right? But either way, if you're for some reason obsessed with finding out who is a Jewish and who is a not Jewish, you can literally look the info up on the internet, like RTSG did for the Debunking Judeo-Bolshevism master thread, which you'll be able to find a link for that in the description of this after we finish the stream. And guess what, right? When you do that, you discover that at no time in Soviet history, no time in all of their history, were the Bolsheviks or their leadership, then later the Soviets and Soviet leadership, majority Jewish. So in order to believe this nonsense, you have to ignore literally all of the facts that you can easily look up on the question. And then you have to, I don't know, make a wish that these evil Jewishes, because they're Jewishes, just wanted to kill all the white Christians without any evidence whatsoever. And I mean nothing that they ever said or wrote pointed in that direction. None of the actions of the actual Soviets, the actual Bolsheviks, could ever imply such a thing to anyone with even a single solitary brain cell being used to think about whether or not such a thing is true. You need to completely make that up from scratch. And then you can say, well, they made laws against anti-Semitism, and then you use that as your evidence, which isn't even the dumbest part of the entire thing, right? Because of course they made laws against anti-Semitism, you utter imbeciles. Look at the insane and stupid things you people do and say. The Eastern European and Central Asian anti-Semites of that day were even dumber than Dr. Frankenstein Lopez here, if you can believe that. They were literally torturing and murdering Jewish people and other people that they guessed were Jewishes, sound familiar, because they thought that they were magically making crops not grow. Seriously, it was just as stupid back then to be obsessive about finding Jewishes and believing in magic as it is today. But this magical crop issue, right? it gets us to the main topic we're going to discuss tonight. And another reason Dr. Laupis here is a complete moron that no one should ever take seriously. I don't want to get too deep into it, as that's what Mac will be here to take us through. But Dr. Laupis tells us that this evil Jewish that totally wasn't engaged in treason and actually represents communism was behind the Holodomor and killed 60 million white Christians in it, which is insane, right? Like I just said, that's very hard to do when there were only 44 million people total in all of Ukraine at the time. But she wants all of us to believe that these scary, evil Jewishes and communists just murdered multiple countries worth of people. And then about a decade later, successfully raised an army in a war they still refer to as the Great Patriotic War and defeated the Nazi menace. I don't know. I feel like you got to be a special kind of stupid to believe anyone would be feeling even remotely patriotic after an entire country's worth of people gets wiped out. But I don't know, maybe it's just me, right? I don't get over 20K likes on dumb nonsense like this, which is huge engagement, right? Now, all this obviously comes while the Zionist monsters, actual monsters, are trying to get us to believe that their genocide is because everyone is an anti-Semite. So let's do the math here, right? In order to believe this insanity, you have to believe in the dumbest things imaginable. All these neo-Nazis are nowhere to be found in the real world, but suddenly social media is flooded with dumb nonsense like what Lou Piss is telling us, right? And it's all getting super huge traction. I don't know about you guys, but I smell a rat. I think Lopez is a Zionist or a wizard. And you guys know what we do with wizards around here, right? Anyway, Mac from RTSG is here, and I'm going to bring him on in a minute, and we are going to tear all this brain rot to shreds. You guys ready? Good. Me too. Let's do it. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Noah's Show. I'm Noah Kachivik. With me, as always, is Daniel Gutierrez, the best producer I've ever met in my entire life. How you doing tonight, Daniel?
Great. Doing great. It's, for some reason, it feels like almost spring weather here in New York City. It's kind of bizarre, but it's kind of beautiful. Yeah, had a nice weekend volunteering with ACP comrades. Did some work in the community. So yeah, just doing very cool. Doing great.
It's weirdly like warm and cold at the same time. I know that sounds silly, but like it'll be freezing in the morning and then warm up in the afternoon. And I'm like right in the season where I'm going from exterior work to interior work. So I keep having to like shuffle things around. It's overwhelming while I have all the party work to do and all this other stuff. But maybe we should hit on. I don't want to like blather on for a long time because I want to get to Mac and debunking this Holodomor nonsense. But we do got to at least briefly touch on our president-elect's cabinet picks, which are rolling in LAMF, as they say. I'm kind of coming to the conclusion that Trump is more and more going to be acting a lot like the Radlibs act going forward from here, where he's basically going to be there to recuperate any possible radical or dissident energy into the establishment, right? You don't start hanging out with Elon Musk because you're an anti-establishment, anti-war kind of guy. You just don't. And his picks, I mean, Matt Gaetz, yeah, okay. Tulsi Gabbard is cool on Syria, but nothing else. Though, you know, the whole being in charge of PSYOPs is a red flag. I don't know. What's your take on his picks?
Yeah, I mean, Marco Rubio is like one of my least favorite people on earth. Mm-hmm. I can think of like very few people who are as like hateable as Marco. So that was, I mean, but at the same time, it's almost like, why pick somebody so stupid? And it's almost, it's very bizarre. Kind of some of the picks that, like, I almost hope that because some of these people that he's putting into his cabinet are so dumb, like Mike Huckabee, and Marco Rubio and Elon Musk, that it just kind of like just furthers the deterioration and the legitimacy of the state.
No
One
kidding.
can only hope. But yeah, it's been kind of wild to see some of these picks. Yeah, Matt Gaetz and Tulsi Gabbard are sort of interesting. A little bit of like like a slightly controversial potentially, in terms of like the deep state. But I mean, at this rate, I really can't put too many of like, my eggs in that basket. I'm not really holding out that much hope.
Yeah. The only thing I kind of thought was interesting was RFK's Make America Healthy Again thing. But other than that, I don't know, man. This whole like what's the Doge department they're trying to create now? Seems like the dumbest bait and switch tactic imaginable. The Department of Government Efficiency, run by these sleazy establishment goons like Elon Musk, who is like basically dependent on government contracts. If that's not a sort of conflict of interest, I don't know what it is. It's weird because like all of a lot of the MAGA people are starting to make excuses, right? Like, oh, he's forced to do this, and it's like, come on, man. Literally, like Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk are straight up in a few years going to be telling us to live in the pod and eat the bugs. I don't know. That's just how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty silly. It just looks really silly. I'm imagining that it's going to be really silly. It's going to be a pretty silly cabinet and just pretty silly, all around like administration.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe that's good. Maybe that's good for us. Maybe that's good for communists, because it's just going to be a total shit show.
I think it will be. And I think people are going to lose heart in Trump. And they're going to be looking for something else, right? I don't know. That's just me. I don't want to get too far off the topic because in a minute here, we are going to tear the Holodomor conspiracy to little itty bitty pieces. So get ready for that. It's coming right after this, everybody.
High Sheriff Hazard is a hard man to be. High Sheriff is his only plan. He digs through pockets, takes what he can, for he's High Sheriff Hazard. He caught me one evening, and here's what he said: "You look like a Russian, you look like a red, and if you're fond of your skin and your head, beware the High Sheriff of Hazard."
All right, everybody, we are back, and with me is Matt from RTSG. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing quite well indeed.
Awesome, very good. I appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. I know it's really late over in Croatia, so thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. It is a bit late, but business calls, I suppose. Duty calls.
I feel you there. So, for anybody who doesn't know Mac or know what RTSG is, can you give them like a sort of quick rundown of what's going on and why we have you here?
Yeah, certainly. So RTSG is a research collective. We mostly operate on the Substack and Twitter. We also have a Twitter news account. We deal with politics, philosophy, international relations, and similar. And as far as I go, I'm one of the, I guess, showrunners of the whole project. I do research, writing, primarily history, primarily Soviet history. Last time I was here for the Munich Agreement, and yeah, we're doing some good work, if I do say so myself. So that's more or less that.
Absolutely. I really like your work, and I really like the work of Chen, who's a Chinese friend of ours and focuses his work on China and modern China and technology and stuff. It's really cool. For anyone interested in checking RTSG out, I'm going to put links in the description after this. I apologize for them not being there already. I was sort of rushing, throwing this thing together. I got out of work a little bit late today. So anyway, tonight we're going to be talking about the Holodomor and how much these neo-Nazis and this myth grind my gears. I was talking about this low piss lady, right? She just says the most insane things, like humanly impossible things, right? That just like a little bit of research, not even as deep as Mac's gonna go, can debunk. But we're gonna go pretty deep tonight, and I don't know. Take it away, Mac. How do you want to start this?
Yeah. Well, I guess I will just briefly address this phenomenon on Twitter that Lupus here is doing and the other right-wingers, where they just say something kind of insane by any historiographical standard, and they get a lot of traction for it. It's really quite interesting. I feel like it's bought it, like maybe not, at least partially, as perturbed in one way or another. But it is a common phenomenon. That's why we addressed the Judeo-Bolshevik stuff before. And now, yeah, this is, in the past few days, kind of randomly became a topic of the discourse, probably because she said what she said about the topic, and among other people, right? And there is kind of a revival in more recent historiography, pop history, you could say, about the Holodomor narrative, right? You have authors like Anne Applebaum, who's a Canadian, right? Yeah, I think she's Canadian or American author, pop history. She's a, yeah, sorry.
No, I think she's American, but I could be wrong. Yeah, she's terrible.
Yeah, she's really bad. Yeah, she's made the Harvest of Sorrow, right? That's the book.
Yeah. She's basically the female Robert Conquest, right?
Yeah, she's actively kind of Red Famine. Sorry, so Harvest of Sorrow is something else. But yeah, she is kind of reviving this Cold War narratives about Holodomor and other aspects of Soviet history and whatnot. She also made that famous "the bad guys are winning" thing with Lukashenko, Putin, Xi, and whatnot. I mean, that kind of went hard. I think that backfired.
That backfired big time. It's kind of like the word tanky. We just took it and we're like,
exactly,
yeah, we are tanky.
Exactly.
Do something.
So as far as she goes, right? So she published that book in like 2016 or 2017. And I mean, she's a journalist first and foremost, right? I mean, I don't like to. We were talking about academia last time. Academia is not everything, but sometimes, especially if you put out bad stuff, it can be connected to the fact that you're not a professional in the field. And she has very suspicious connections, to say the least. I mean, she's the wife of the Polish Minister of Defense, if I'm not mistaken. And in general, she's connected to all sorts of nationalist organizations in Ukraine, like these sort of Some of them are probably NGOs that, you know, push the whole Holodomor narrative and whatnot. So I mean, she has obviously like a conflict of interest here. I guess just to summarize all of this, and this is a very interesting thing about historiography in general today, is that you have narratives like the one Appleblom is putting out, and then you have the more well-established liberal academics like Dogger, Wheatcroft, Davies, even Ellman, who then respond to something like that, or they respond basically repeating what they wrote like 20, 15 years ago. And Togger and Wheatcroft specifically responded to Appleblom, and they just like completely debunk it. However, her narrative is more popular. You know, the even though the liberal consensus in academia is, if you explained it to someone who's an anti-communist, it would sound like a communist narrative. Mm-hmm. That is actually the liberal academic consensus, more or less. And then you have Appleblom, who is doing, you know, something completely opposite to any kind of quality research. I mean, she did put to light some interesting anecdotes, more or less, but beyond that, her overarching narratives and the stuff that she did, like, she made some very big and basic mistakes, to say the least. Anyway, so
yeah,
this is
didn't
kind of
Togger write a review of her book? They just tore it to shreds, right?
Yeah, exactly. I can just briefly mention that review. For example, just like one blatant mistake, one of the biggest points in historiography. Okay, I hope you're still here now. I guess RTSG is taking over again for the second time. I mean, but I was gonna say, yeah. So one of the mistakes that,
sorry about that. My camera like software just blanked out for a minute. I'm here. Don't worry.
Yeah. I was saying, yeah. So Togger, for example, points out the mistake that she makes, a very rudimentary mistake, which is that in the research of Holodomor, it's been known for quite a while that official numbers of grain yield by the Soviet government inflate the numbers, right? Not intentionally, for various technical reasons, right? So historians have, like, one of the biggest topics of research has been exactly that, exactly to deflate accurately the actual number or the actual yield of the in 1931, for example, and 1932, and all the years of the Holodomor. And basically, Appleblom just uses the Soviet official numbers, which were inflated, and she uses that for 1932 and 1931. And then in 1933, she uses the deflated accurate numbers by historians. So then, because the two earlier numbers are inflated because they are from the Soviet government, again, for technical reasons that happened, and 1933 is deflated, it seems like production did not change in these 3 years. And in fact, in 1933, there was no increase in production, when in reality, there was a substantial increase in production. So it's not just that she's using the old wrong numbers. It's also that she's cherry picking specific years where the inflated or deflated numbers suit her narrative. So I think this fact alone discredits her argument. Like, there is no point in reading a book after someone writes something like that. That's kind of my argument here.
Yeah, in the business, we call that a lie.
Exactly.
And that's the sort of thing all these anti-communist writers will do. They'll sort of manipulate the way they present stuff in order to meet their narrative objective, rather than look for the truth.
Yeah.
And I mean, it goes back to Conquest does the same thing, right? Timothy Snyder does that kind of cherry picking. Everyone does that sort of thing. And people, here's the thing, people just don't check. I had the misfortune of listening to Haas have to debate some of these people the other day, or today while I was at work, actually. And Haas is always very funny with it, but it just, like, listening to them realize in real time that they never check any sources. All they do is look for something that verifies something they want to believe, right? And that's all these writers prey upon people doing that. The minute you begin checking sources and then checking that source to see if it lines up with a primary source, the lies become glaringly evident.
Yeah. Probably the most famous example of this is the Black Book of Communism. Because with the Black Book of Communism, the 100 million number, which is another example of something that liberal academia has debunked 20 years ago, but that's still in popular thought. In any case, like we're just talking about raw numbers, not even getting into intentionality or whatnot. But anyway, like, as you know, in the Black Book of Communism, the writers were obsessed with this number 100 million, right? So much so that they completely invented numbers or counted dubious numbers, like killed Germans in World War II as in Nazi soldiers, not the civilian casualties, but the Nazi soldiers were a part of the Soviet, those are the victims of communism, the SS soldiers and the Wehrmacht.
Which is crazy. What my favorite one from that is they go to census data, right, and say there's a discrepancy of babies being born, literally saying we guess that more babies should have been born. So all of these are victims of communism now.
Yeah. They invent people. I guess that's the magic, like the Judeo-Bolshevik magic that you were talking about earlier. But
all the Jewishes and the
yeah. And I mean, with Black Book of Communism, that went to such absurd measures that people, like some of the authors, stepped away from the book in later years. But anyway, no, we can start talking about the Holodomor if you wanna.
Yeah, the floor is yours, brother. Go to it. Let's dive right in.
Right.
I'm excited about this.
Right. Well, I guess I'd like to start actually a bit earlier than the Holodomor because there's an important context to it, of course, and I will not get into like the history of Soviet famines and whatnot, but suffice to say that the Soviet Union, or more accurately Russia, had a chronic issue with famines, much like China did before Mao. And this was a kind of historical, cyclical process. Like very often there was, like almost cyclically, there were big periods of mass scale starvation. Now, usually it would just lead to mass malnourishment, which is not great either. But sometimes it manifested in real famines, of course. So you get, of course, the Civil War and whatnot. The Soviet Union, the logistics and everything is in the dump, and you get to 1920s, late 1920s, basically. So NEP is still in force, but more and more so it is lacking. It's lacking more and more, basically, which is something that people do not focus on. Anti-communists sometimes say, oh, the Soviet Union, it was doing great. Like they conceded to capitalism. They were doing great during the NEP, that is. But then collectivization ruined everything and whatnot. And that's not quite the case. In 1927, already the NEP was failing to quite a decisive in quite a decisive way.
Let me interrupt real quick, because this is always something that sort of drives me crazy about the way people talk about this. The NEP was for a specific time and place, and it worked for a while. And then when it stopped working, they went to something else that would work. And when people sort of try to debunk communism or whatever, they forget that conditions are what produce our policies and how we orient ourselves, right? That something may be good in one time and place and then not good in another time and place. They just say, oh, this is always the thing that'll be good. And if it's good, it will continue being good forever and ever and ever. And that's just not the way reality works.
Yeah. I mean, nothing to add there. But in any case, there was a famine. There was a famine that encompassed a few 100,000 people in Ukraine and Russia in the late 1920s, right? And the Soviets were more and more frustrated with the lack of capacity of their country, agricultural capacity of their country, so to speak. So one of the Soviet officials, Petrovsky, says here, so he compares Soviet agriculture with France. He says, where farmers are 45% of the population but feed the country, or agriculture in the US, which feeds the whole country and competes on all markets. But our peasants, which are 83% of the population, stand on such a low level of development that they do not produce sufficient bread either for the remaining 17% of the population in industrial centers and towns, or for themselves. So the Soviet Union had almost twice the amount of their, like almost 2 times the amount of their population were peasants, agriculture, farmers and whatnot, than France. Yet they were having these chronic issues with food and whatnot. And this was fundamentally due to lack of development, lack of technology and whatnot. So this is where the big push to bring in tractors and modern technology and the infamous tractors in this period.
People, that's another thing people, the like anti-communists don't get, that like there was a reason that there was such low output. They were literally trying to reap fields with hand sickles. That's what the sickle and the hammer and sickle is for. The peasants actually use those. And when they develop these, and then and then when the kulaks begin renting machinery to people, it comes at too high a price, right? The state comes in and basically opens up the equivalent of a tractor library for people, where you could go and use tractors to get your, anyway, that's completely ignored. And the update in technology is also completely ignored, which I also find, not so puzzling.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is ignored, and also not puzzling why it's ignored. But in any case, the Soviets were, here, this was like what Petrovsky said, was actually kind of an endorsement of the technical capabilities and the technological capabilities of the US and France. In fact, they were really impressed by US mass agriculture in the US. The US, I think, was the leading power in this aspect. They were the biggest producers of this. And one of the leading figures was Campbell, who was a doctor of engineering, and also he had a degree in law. He was a super competent guy who was running a lot of big farms in the US, like massive, I don't know how many thousands of acres in the US. And they actually brought him to the Soviet Union twice for consultations on how to, once he met Stalin personally, on how to improve agriculture, right? So the leading, actually, this is important, I guess, to emphasize. Obviously, collectivization and the Sovkhoz and the Kolkhoz model had ideological considerations behind it, right? But the most immediate consideration for them was just improving the output of agriculture, improving, like making a stable economy so you don't have to worry about food anymore, right? And this is the absolute bedrock for anything else. And this was the most pressing issue. And just before I get to Campbell, in fact, actually, it's kind of related, right? With his expertise, obviously in consultations among other people, in the 1920s, also late 1920s, they actually were making experiments, like small-scale kolkhozes, basically, in certain regions of the country, and these universally proved to be more efficient than the previous NEP model, which was for them a big signal that it's about time to make the switch.
Now, for anyone who's not aware, kolkhoz is just the Russian word for a collective farm.
Yeah. And Sovkhoz is the national farm.
And it was way more efficient, because why wouldn't it be? Right? You come together and get a big farm, or, you're basically the Russian equivalent of sharecropping on someone else's. I mean, come on,
Yeah, we were getting now, there was that Soviet song with like a propaganda trailer or music video, I guess. I think it's from after the World War II, but it's like you see these massive fields. Actually, it might be from the 30s. I cannot quite remember. Someone probably knows what I'm talking about. Massive fields, like insane, again, acreage. But these types of large scale production in agriculture was basically impossible with the previous models, where you had these small localities of like 10 peasants, like doing whatever, and they had their children also work in the field, like as soon as they could physically and whatnot, as it went in the villages. And so it was just like a very like kind of primitive and small scale level of production, which the Soviets, with this newfound demand for everything, you couldn't keep up. I mean, they couldn't keep up even with the status quo, let alone with the fact that they were preparing for war in their mind at this time. I mean, the Stalin said, what, in 1931, he said that we are going to have war in 10 years, right? We got to prepare or else we are crushed. So this is also something to keep in mind. Hitler was just about, coming to power and everything in 1932. But yeah, that's about that. That's as far as that goes, right? So in the 1920s, right, there was this famine that I just described. Obviously, it was smaller scale than the Holodomor and whatnot, but this was like the breaking point in a lot of ways. And they, again, from these small scale experiments, they found empirical evidence really that the collective model and the national model works better. So now we get to the 1930s. Now, the 1930s, I'm not sure how to actually really go about this exactly, because I guess I'll just start with the raw numbers and the procurement, the yields, and some of the technical aspects of the
Before we get to that, I want to kind of set the scene for people, right? Like, if we're in Ukraine in the 1930s, we're in a very tumultuous time, right? Where you have people that were Ukrainian who are now part of Poland. You have the nationalists kicking around still, forming sort of pro-Nazi groups. You have the richer families that had been given money in the Stolypin reforms, right? That now had their lands sort of really condensed, and their ability to collect monopoly profits from the state removed because of all these smaller kolkhozs or collective farms that are popping up almost in a grassroots way too, right? And so you have these like tensions that are kind of boiling over into little bits of violence here and there, because Ukraine, along with having a lot of nationalism, especially in the West, or what we should say is just Nazism, really, because that's what it becomes. But it's also a very, very patriotic country that was, like a lot of party members come from the Ukraine. A lot of Red Army soldiers come from Ukraine. So ideologically, it's a battleground, and just economically, it's also a battleground. So that's where everybody is going into what Mac's going to get into now.
Yeah. Certainly, the Soviet Union was almost chronically in a state of some kind of low-key crisis, be it diplomatic or domestic or international relations wise, or similar. 1930s, this famine and whatnot, basically the sum of it all is that it was a really bad year for agriculture, right? For various reasons. 1931 was like a super damp year, basically. And the Soviets, obviously, they expected, they had certain expectations in place on how to proceed with their industrialization plans and whatnot. 1930 was fine, actually, pretty good. I mean, keep in mind, this was 1 year after the NEP ended. So this was almost kind of immediately after all this. So they were, and since 1930 did quite well, they were expecting to keep going in this direction, right? But 1931, for various reasons, mostly because of the exceptional dampness and whatnot, was a really bad year for crops, right?
Let me jump in real quick. There were a few other this is the number one reason for the poor harvest in 31, right?
Yeah.
There's a few others though that add up to it really becoming bad, right? It's just inclement weather. There's a specific kind of disease that wheat crops can get where as the blade grows up, the blade of wheat grows up, it's already dead. And I forget the name of it. Now,
The
I mean,
crop
it's
rust.
been years since I researched this, but that was going all over Western Ukraine at the time, right? Along with, rodent infestations and the political tensions that were happening too. So like all of these things add up, but primarily it was this weather. I mean, no, I'm sorry. It was Stalin really being a mean guy and wanting to eat everyone's grain with a giant spoon and then
Exactly.
their babies, because why not?
Yeah. I mean, that's how it usually goes. So I don't see why this would be an exception, right?
Right. That's what communism is, right? Like that's
Yeah.
why we can't have it here in America, because nobody wants Stalin to eat their babies. That's scary, man.
Yeah. It is quite scary, actually. But I was gonna say, like Tolger describes this as chronic agricultural crisis in Soviet history,
I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Mac. Mark Togger is a brilliant famine expert and an anti-communist. So I want people to remember that fact, that we're not just, believing whatever the commies say. This guy's an anti-communist who's just interested in the truth. And this is his research that's basically the leading research on the subject in the 21st century.
Yeah, Tolger is one of those people who he's kind of like George Getty in The Great Purge or Carly in Soviet Diplomacy, or like you just have these kind of exceptional, very pretty professional, although liberal authors on this topic who kind of do publish the facts more or less. Like I feel like they have a certain level of professionalism. They don't make mistakes like Appleblom does. Like mistakes. Like the mistakes they're made are highly technical, and they usually get corrected over like some kind of through some kind of review or similar. Like Dover and Wheatcroft and Davies, they had like a kind of academic fight for a while in 2007, and then in the end they made a paper together, for example. And Davies and Wheatcroft are the other two very prominent researchers on the Holodomor. And for some reason, they always work together. I guess that's what they do.
When you're the only three honest ones, how could you not, right?
Yeah, I guess that's, naturally they just bonded or something. I was going to say, so there was, as you said, there was rodents, there was crop rust, as it's called. And in 1932, it says, so this is from Wheatcroft, one quarter to a half of wheat was destroyed by contamination in 1932, for example. In 1932, actually, the yields were higher, but the destruction, let's say, of yield of crops when they were stored and when they were usually incorrectly and whatnot, was so high that actually the usable amount of grain was much lower than expected, right? And so that's I guess the raw kind of. So the numbers here, I'll get to the numbers actually. So in 1930, the Soviet official number for a yield harvest of crops was 83.5 million tons, and in 1931 it was 69 million, and in 1932 it was also 69 million. In 1933 it was 68 million. So these numbers sound a bit weird. Now, the actual numbers that Wheatcroft, Tolger, and whatnot get to is that in 1930 it was 78 million. And in 1931 it was 69 million also. But in as the official statistic. But in 1932, it was somewhere between 53 to 58 million, which is a massive drop, basically. Now, already 60 million or so is a critical level of like a critically low level of crops, right? So for it to drop 10 plus more million tons was pretty much devastating. And then in 1933, it goes back to 71 million tons. Now, the reason why this happened, like this mismatch in reported and actual yields, is more or less due to the aforementioned factors, especially in 1932, where the yield was high again, but during storage and during transport even and similar, it's impossible for peasants to calculate the amount of grain that would subsequently get destroyed by contamination and similar. They get their grain, they store it, I guess they weigh it and whatnot, but they cannot necessarily know how much of it is usable or not. There are methods to do that, but because this was such an exceptional period in the sense that so much grain was unusable, especially then, they accidentally basically over-reported their yields. Now, this was an issue for multiple reasons, and a lot of policies and logic of Soviet relief and aid to Ukraine and whatnot was worsened by the fact that this stuff was over-reported, right? And that's because if they thought that they had 67 or 69 or also almost 70 million tons of grain to operate with, but in reality they had 15 million less tons, then their whole operation, their whole management of this grain has to be completely changed, because suddenly they can only give so much to either republics. They have to, at that point, they cannot put stuff in strategic reserves, for example, or they have to take stuff out of the strategic reserves and similar. So the wrong numbers made a huge mess, basically, in the whole logistical and operational process of Soviet relief effort, which was also worsened by the fact that Russia and the Soviet Union in general has an under-governance problem, especially in this period, which is quite chaotic. The communication to Moscow was pretty poor. And so you have these letters from Stalin and from various local leaders who have completely different information about yields and the situation on the ground and similar. So that's one part of that.
Yeah, I want to talk just briefly, because I don't want to get super into the weeds about the telegrams back and forth between the Central Committee and the Ukrainian Soviet, right? If I'm remembering correctly, Stalin was basically yelling at them for misreporting and for not reporting quickly enough when problems began to arise. And he's telling them that, look, people are going to begin to start starving. You're going to be literally murdering people at that point, right? This isn't a joke. This isn't something you can slack off on. And I think it's funny that we have these telegrams and they're in the Soviet archives for anyone to look at. Yet there are still people who say, Stalin was a big meanie who wanted to eat everyone's baby and he did this. It's crazy to me. I don't know.
Yeah. There is, I guess, a lot of technicalities about these numbers and whatnot. But basically, here, I will just quote Davies and Wheatcroft, because if we start to get into all the technicalities about numbers and the various communications, it's impossible. So I will just quote Davies and Wheatcroft kind of to close this, and then I guess if someone who will join after this segment to ask questions, once we get into technicalities, we can do that. So Davies and Wheatcroft say, the food crisis in the towns and reduced exports at the time, we'll get into that also, the reduced exports at a time of serious balance of payments difficulties and the failure to build up grain stocks were all consequences of a grave crisis of grain shortage, not one simulated for political purposes. So I guess this is that's quite important to note, that this was a genuine crisis of logistics and of management in general, not something simulated for political purposes. There's no evidence for that, obviously. Now, even Elman, who's he's like an anti-communist historian. He's not just a liberal, but he's kind of some of the remnants of conquest and whatnot. So he says it is entirely possible that factors stressed by Davies and Beechcroft account for the overwhelming majority of the deaths, and the intended deaths were only a small, possibly very small, so this is him coping, proportion of them, right? So even Elman here concedes to Davies and Beechcroft, for example. And more broadly, when we talk about the Soviet approach and why would it even be for political reasons? Some people say, oh, Stalin hated the peasants, right? He wanted the people in the cities and whatnot to I don't know. He thought they were the real revolutionaries, and he had anti-peasant policy. Trotsky actually had an anti-peasant policy. Trotsky was very Bukharin too. Bukharin was for summary executions of a lot of people back in the 30s, early 1930s. But Trotsky's policy was explicitly completely hostile to the peasants, for example. But Stalin again proving that he's the golden center in any case.
My dad used to call it walking the Stalin line, right? Between proletariat and peasant, right? Between country and city. And Stalin was known throughout the Soviet Union as the guy who had the peasantry's back. Right, they were the great majority of the country, and this is why my grandmother, until the day she died, prayed for Stalin every night before bed, even long after Stalin himself had passed. Right, because he was the man that stuck up for the peasants, and I think it's an issue of theory in a way, right, where Trotsky and Bukharin had this very mechanical view of dialectics. Right, Trotsky less so than Bukharin, who was a little more advanced, but nevertheless, it was making an orthodoxy and a dogma out of the proletariat and the development of the proletariat, and automatically assuming that the peasantry, because it's a remnant of a bygone era, is reactionary, and that its interests will always be reactionary. Right, and they get this. They don't get this from nowhere. They get it from Marx. Right, but they're misunderstanding Marx in one era, right, where Marx towards the end of his life, and they weren't privy to these letters, but he was writing to Russian revolutionaries, telling them that no, the peasantry can absolutely have a revolutionary potential, especially in Russia, because of the communal sort of social consciousness that they developed over the centuries, right? So the old orthodox line that they were trying to take was, well, the only real revolutionary is the proletarian because of the development of capitalism. Lenin, however, his entire theory is based in the peasantry, and Stalin sort of continues this, and he speaks about peasant social relations in Economic Problems of Socialism in USSR. And he covers this issue of collectivization, right, and kind of briefly as an overview, right, in that you can't just proletarianize people. That doesn't work, and it pisses people off. The reason proletarian revolutions even begin, right, is because people were proletarianizing. Being part of the proletariat is not fun, right? You get stuck in this, situation where you got no way out. You're forced to reproduce your own exploitation every single day, and you can't break out of that. And so what Stalin says is that this sort of thing that Marx mentions of the Russian social consciousness can just be walked along to socialism, right? And that's what the collective forms were. They were a sort of step along the road towards the sort of sublation of private property, where it's not really private property anymore that they have. It's a collective form of property, but it's not like, the surplus is being put back into society. This surplus is being put into their pockets, right? So it's a way of bringing the peasantry forward, and it worked. Like That's the thing that the anti-communists don't get. It worked very, very, very well. People forget that this region had a famine a few years before this in Volga in Ukraine, right? And the affected areas of Kazakhstan had it, famines going all back through history, right? And Kazakhstan actually got hit way harder by this Holodomor shortages than Ukraine did. And then after this one last famine, never again, right? Even when there were lower grain yields, right? Never again, because the surplus in the rest of society could make up for it.
Yeah, yeah. You said something interesting about how this was in many ways a continuation of the, or not continuation, but that the Soviet peasants had this feeling of communal culture, let's say, just like, you know, collectivist and stuff. Here, so there is an analysis about that. I was going to talk about resistance, like peasant resistance. I think this is interesting. Then I guess, but actually, I'll keep that thought in mind. But just I guess to talk about, just to say that. So we were talking about Stalin and this narrative. Actually, never mind. Let's get to the resistance.
Yeah. So that's right. Before we do,
all right, you go.
One of the books that gets brought up when we talk about the resistance to collectivization, is that what we're talking about next?
Yeah.
Is Douglas Toddle's Fraud, Famine, and Fascism, which is a good book. I've read it. I have it over here. But I want to make people just be careful about this book. The numbers have been called into question. I've never looked into whether these questions were correct or not, but just so you're aware, like, there are arguments against it. It still gives a good story about how the sort of kulaks were acting and Ukrainian Nazis and stuff like that. That's all good. Just be careful. The numbers may have issues. That's all.
So there's this one historian, Bokharov, and he talks about why actually there wasn't that much resistance to the collectivization efforts in this early period. And one of the reasons, so he says, the kolkhoz in certain ways, especially in its collectivizations of land use and principles of egalitarian distribution, was not all that far from peasant traditions and values in corporate villages throughout the USSR. In any case, this example and the evidence that the vast majority of peasants did not engage in protest against collectivization clearly disproves blah 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 assertion that villages were united against collectivization. So that's an interesting quote, actually. I mean, it does make sense, right? That the peasants were not, like, why would they be keen on having I guess what we would call a kulak or someone above them, like
right,
dictating how much they can work, restricting, like, you know, these guys are getting the shiny tractors, why can't we have them also, etc.
It's also to me, I don't know, it's funny that people act as if, like, this collectivization was sort of out of nowhere, right? That there wasn't already a basis for it. But the sort of most of rural, the entire Soviet Union, especially Russia, Ukraine, the Russian speaking countries, they had these sort of collective lands going all the way back through history, right? And it was relatively recent that some families got bigger lands privatized by the czars in the oh god, I just said it, that the something reforms are called. Anyway, these specific families get this privatized land given to them, right? So basically, people that have been living there forever and ever and ever have to go elsewhere, and there's a whole mix-up, right? People moving around and stuff.
Reforms.
Why would people not want to go back to what they've always known in a better form? I don't know.
Yeah. So I guess I should make a more substantive argument about the small amount of resistance, right? Because I feel like this is one of the biggest topics also, that there was mass peasant resistance against collectivization, right? So in 1930, so there was in total 13,000 rebellions, which sounds a bit rough, right? Rebellions. Now, this is a technical word that they use. There was 1,000 in February, 6,500 in March, and 2,000 in April. Now, of these, only around in global 3% were suppressed by force, right? For that's kind of that's a small number, I would say, overall. And moreover, as Stogger here says, considerably more than 90% of these events were small scale and non-violent. And judging from the 307 cases of women protests mentioned above, most were resolved peaceably and often in peasants' favor, right? So that's also quite important to note. Peasants obviously were reacting to this change that's happening. So these rebellions, that's really, the Russians, that's the word they use, but you could say like protest, like small scale protest, any kind of like small boycott or anything like that is a rebellion in this context, right? And I was going to say, usually because the people who were organizing the kolkhozes and putting people into them, they weren't really there to just like, fucking shoot them or something or whatever. They would usually explain to them various facts of their workplace or whatnot. It really was usually, or their demands. Obviously, they would put out some demands and that they would work out some kind of compromise or something. I want to say it was kind of a bureaucratic, political, technical process, more so than some kind of military suppression of these people and whatnot. Now, there is, as I said earlier, 6,500 protests in March, which is a huge increase, 6.5 times more than in February of that year. And this is because Stalin at this time published his essay "Dizzy with Success," right in March, and that essay was really widespread among peasants and whatnot. And what did peasants protest about that specifically? Well, in that essay, Stalin says that basically he was criticizing the local governments, which were forcing peasants into kolkhozes, and not. He basically, what he wanted or what he was advocating were these spontaneous kolkhozes forming, which was happening on a relatively good scale. In fact, Stalin criticized the very rapid pace of collectivization at various points. So it does make sense that he would also want this to be a more of a spontaneous and natural process, more so than political process, let's say. And so with the peasants, what they were protesting here, they were like, oh, so Comrade Stalin wants us to spontaneously on our own make these kolkhozes. Why did these bureaucrats then tell us that we have to get into the kolkhozes? So this was their issue. So in fact, these protests were against the local bureaucrats and whatnot usually, and not against the state policy like as such. Now there's a few, like two more things to say about the resistance and whatnot. And that's that there was kind of, because it was a new thing and whatnot, there was a misunderstanding. Like the peasants had certain narratives, I guess, and mentality about the collectivizations, which wasn't completely accurate and whatnot. So it says here, and this is what I said earlier. So this is from Tolger. I was just paraphrasing it earlier. Their confusion, so peasants' confusion about collectivization, may explain why the vast majority of the protests, as the 1931 OGPU report indicated, were resolved by explanations and persuasion. So that sounds like some communist propaganda. Oh, they were just talking to them. It really did kind of happen like that, because again, for most peasants, it was in their material interest to get into this new relationship of production. So there is no reason why this would have to escalate as such.
Right. It would be sort of like, let's say we're all, hanging out one day. We all live in the same neighborhood, and party members started coming to our house saying, "Hey, you're now part owner of this factory, right? Go work in that," right? I mean, almost all of us would jump at the chance to do that, right? To actually build something of our own and make more money. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that, right?
Yeah. So here Tolger just elaborates a bit. So he says, so in a province, Ryazan in Russia, he talks about this pattern. So he says, when kolkhoz organizer conducted sufficient explanatory work, collectivization proceeded successfully. And now there is a funny anecdote here. So he says, in one village, organizers forced the kolkhoz on the peasants and they resisted, while in a neighboring one, organizer explained it at length and the peasants joined. And the anecdote is, in another case, women peasants came to the village meeting intending to disrupt it, but when they found out what the kolkhoz actually was, they joined it. So, for example, there is now, Tolger mentions this a lot in this paper, which is called like human factors in the Holodomor and peasant resistance, something like this. And he says that it is a bit hard to quite like. There's a bit of a tendency in historiography to look at the official numbers and the anecdotal reports, but this seems to be the trend. There isn't really anything to show that this was not the trend. Obviously, the kulaks were treated somewhat differently. Now, to be honest, I don't have much ready about the kulaks. So if you want, you can talk about that.
Yeah, I could talk briefly about them, but I want to first. This sounds a lot like when I talk to my coworkers or neighbors or something about communism, right? Like at first they're all like, "Oh, like Stalin's gonna eat all our babies. How could you want Stalin to eat everyone's baby?" And then I explain what communism is, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, I like that," right?
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like showing people that, like, look, if that's what a communist is, I like you communists. It's not a huge issue. Anyway, the kulaks, we've already explained what they were, like economically speaking, right? We also have to explain that this was, again, a politically turbulent era. Now, the communists are overwhelmingly popular, right? They ended the war. They're getting these collective farms going. People's lives are genuinely improving. But there are a lot of people who were living off of the exploitation of the people whose lives are improving that are very upset about this. And this boosts the numbers of these sort of ultra nationalists who become the Banderite Nazis, right? The organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Banderites were sort of part of that. But these become a Waffen SS division later on. These sort of organized ultranationalists were engaged in murder of kolkhoz personnel, and they were also engaged in sabotage, right? And there's a lot of sort of detailed records that the OUN kept on the sabotage. And the whole point was to get people mad at the Soviet government, right? It was sort of a cause chaos type of strategy. And they would brag in their records of it about keeping grain on the stalk too long until it would rot, right? They would brag about burning entire crops. There is one year where, who knows if their numbers were accurate or not. I've never done the actual work, but I have read their numbers saying that they purposely slaughtered over half the livestock in the Soviet Union during the shortages. Now, imagine that's like over half the pigs and cows, etc., just killed and left to rot. What does that do to food production, right? It screws it up and lowers the yields. So at a time when there's already a lot of distress, their little, struggle they're engaged in is making things worse for the entire population. So that's just some of the things the kulaks were doing at the time. If you're interested in the whole story, that book I mentioned earlier, Douglas Toddle's Proud Famine and Fascism, has the entire thing in it. It's pretty good. But yeah, we don't need to get too deep into the kulaks. They were the Kolkhozs were just naturally fighting back against them, basically. The narrative just goes that they were innocent victims that Stalin and the evil commies decided to steal everything from, right? And they were heroes fighting back. What they were actually doing was they were the aggressor attacking the Kolkhozs.
So I guess to Walk Vulture actually sent me, or he sent the source before about this. I don't actually know the book where this is from because he sent it, but I guess he can provide it if necessary. But anyway, here it says, in Ukraine alone, 521 terrorist acts were registered in March 1930. In the central Black Earth region, 122, including 25 murders. In Western Siberia, over 1,000 terrorist acts occurred in the first 9 months of 1930, including 624 murders and assassination attempts. And in the Urals from January to March 26, 260 terrorist acts. So that's just to give some perspective on the numbers and whatnot. Now, this is not obviously talking just about the kulaks. It's hard to say, who exactly was doing this, but these were like exceptional, numbers in any case, and during this period. And another thing to say about kulaks is that they were 5% of the population, of the peasant population, at least in 1927. That's the official number. So it's, the dynamic is kind of obvious in that they were the richer peasants, obviously not super duper rich compared to European standards, but nevertheless, and perhaps how rich they were is not even that important, and more so how their relationship to other peasants is what's here more important, which was
Precisely
suppressive. In any
there
case.
there was a contradiction between the two classes there that couldn't go unresolved. Stalin actually called the kulaks the Soviet bourgeoisie pretty often.
Yeah.
So just to give you an idea, and here's the thing: they tried negotiating with these people at first, right? They really did, and they were sort of allowed to continue existing in the Soviet Union to the detriment of the Soviet Union as they're engaged in all this stuff. It was only when it became a problem that they could not ignore that they actually started doing something about it.
Here,
yeah, we're running way over where I thought we'd be.
Yeah.
Let's just keep rolling along.
Exactly. I have one more point about the kulaks, and then I can conclude the topic. So Appelblom describes, so this is from the Tolger's response to Appelblom, right? So here he's talking about what she writes. Appelblom describes food shortages in Soviet cities in 1928, but then writes that in Ukraine, quote, police discovered many tons of grain that had been kept back because peasants had, quite rationally, quote unquote, been waiting for prices to rise. And now Tolger comments, by calling peasants' actions rational, Appelblom seems to endorse their withholding food for higher prices, but her subsequent discussion is very critical of Soviet government's measures to induce peasants to stop hoarding and obtain food from starving townspeople. Yet many publications have argued that famines can be caused by farmers or traders withholding food from townspeople, sometimes expressed as the moral economy, the right to subsistence over the right to profit. Appelblom does not consider the possibility that hungry townspeople and Soviet officials trying to feed them could have interpreted these reports as man-made famine created by profiteering peasants, aka kulaks. So this is a very interesting. Yeah. So this is a very interesting narrative. I mean, I would say that certainly. So here we have peasants hoarding stuff because for selfish reasons. This may or may not be kulaks. Probably more often kulaks just because they had more grain and whatnot, and they were kind of the ones selling stuff and whatnot more often.
Let me interrupt you real quick, Mac.
Yeah.
Before the Kolkhozs, they were really the only ones. They had a monopoly on grain to the state, right? And this is why they were able to withhold it and drive the price up from the state. And one of the benefits of the collectivization project was that it eliminated that monopoly, right? There was a thriving free market, believe it or not, in farm products, and not just grain, but all farm products, right? Selling to the state among the collective farms, which I find interesting that the libertarians love these monopolists, yet when the free market without any bureaucracy or much regulation comes along and undercuts those and destroys the monopolies, they hate it because it's called collectivization, you know?
Yeah. So I will conclude, not in my own words, but in words of Tolger. Because Tolger has, in my opinion, one of the greatest conclusions on this topic in his publication in the Beck papers from 2001. And I will just read most of the last paragraph of the conclusion here. So he says, the evidence and the analysis I have presented here show that the Soviet famine was more serious and more important an event than previous studies claim, including those adhering to the Ukrainian nationalist interpretation, and that it resulted from a highly abnormal combination of environmental and agricultural circumstances. By drawing attention to these circumstances, this study also demonstrates the importance of questioning accepted political interpretations and of considering the environmental aspects of famines and other historical events that involve human interaction with the natural world. And one more sentence, that the Soviet regime, through its rationing system, fed more than 50 million people, including many peasants, during the famine, however poorly, and that at least some peasants faced with famine undertook to work with greater intensity despite their hostility to the regime. And to some extent, in previous years as well, indicate that all those involved in some ways recognized the uniqueness of this tragic event. So indeed, I mean, it was a great tragedy. No one denies that. The actual historiographical number is not 60 million, as Anastasia Lupus says, but it is 3 to 3.5 million. Wheatcroft, Davies, Tolger, none of these except the man-made or the genocide narrative. It was a unique tragedy and unique circumstances, political, economic, and environmental. Tolger is a doctor in agriculture, and so he's pretty good with the environmental stuff and whatnot. So more or less, I think I can conclude this topic here on my end.
That was great. I want to just add one thing before we get to everybody's calls and questions. Nobody believed in a Holodomor as it was happening. The word didn't even exist. I want to say that the first time it came up was, I really think Robert Conquest wrote it first. I could be wrong about that in the 50s. But even in the 50s, nobody in America bought it. Right? It only made a resurgence in the 1980s when enough time had passed that it, nobody remembered the famine of 32 in another country, right? So the Reagan administration was able to propagate this for their anti-communist propaganda, and it started making the rounds again. This ties into the, Ukrainian Nazi movement and all that, but we don't need to get into all that right now. The facts that Mac laid out speak for themselves, right? If we have some sort of narrative that makes assumptions about, someone being mean or implies that it reads your mind or someone's mind or whatever it is, question them. Look at what actually happened. All of us are smart enough to do this research ourselves and come to a more accurate conclusion. All right. So that's that. Thank you so much, Mac. That was awesome. It was a really good breakdown of just the facts. Maybe next time what we should do is go from the opposite direction and go point by point on the lies. I think we could bounce it back and forth, right? Here's one lie they do, and here's what actually happened. Here's another lie that, you know what I mean? Yeah, you're good. Mm.
This like
No,
this,
the
right?
stream. Oh,
Okay.
the stream can't
Yeah,
hear
because
you
I
at the
was.
moment.
Yeah. All right, my bad. So I was saying that. Uh, so when this bouncing back and forward, right? So I didn't read the Loopy's tweet initially, and I thought that she made some kind of point by point breakdown or something, a thread or some, because I don't know why did I think that, but and I was like, okay, maybe we can focus the discussion around these arguments and whatnot. So I guess the issue that we are having currently is that counter arguments do not exist, or at least not substantive ones,
Or they're
so
just insane, like hers. Like
yeah,
literally says that more than the entire population of Ukraine was purposely killed in this Holodomor.
Well, to be honest, I think that she said that the Soviet Union in general killed 60 million people, which I mean is not much better.
Okay,
but I mean it's. I imagine. I think benefit of the doubt, right? That's how I interpret it. But she talks about the Holodomor and then puts that number. But I think I don't know, man. I cannot get into the mind of these people. But
either way, it's that the Soviet Union killed over an entire country's worth of people.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, 60 million people is. It's not even. I don't even know where that number is from. Usually, I think they use that number for Mao. Usually, Stalin killed like 24 million people.
Right.
So
like
you're getting into new levels of
World War II. You know.
Yeah. That's actually a good way to put that. That's kind of insane.
It's pretty insane. All right, so let's get going here on our first call. Are you going to stick around and answer questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's my duty.
Awesome. That is exciting. Let me share my screen here, and we'll get right to it. All right, Daniel, who do we have first?
Yeah, John, our weekly pun distributor.
Excellent. What's up, John? What do you got for us tonight, brother?
Well, what happens when a Thanksgiving turkey gets possessed?
What happens when a Thanksgiving turkey gets possessed? Do you get a let me see. Something a gobble. I don't know what.
It becomes a poultrygeist.
Oh, a poultrygeist.
Yeah. That one's pretty foul.
Oh yeah. All right, John. What do you got for us tonight?
All right. My question for today is: I know we have a lot of the names of the famous communists and socialists: Webb Du Bois, William Z. Foster. But might there be some local but still very interesting or eccentric individuals that might not be as well known, well, at least say here in Ohio and the broader Midwest, that just are like really good campfire stories or tall tales?
Just in general about communists?
About communists.
Yeah. I know a few, and a few really good union action stories, but we're kind of running over, so I'll just tell one. One of the most famous events in Cleveland's history is the Huff riots, right? You live in Cleveland, you hear all over about the Huff riots. Huff is a really bad part of Cleveland. There's a few housing projects right there, right? And this is sort of right after integration and the civil rights revolution, right? And it's basically we don't need to go over the whole. There was a lot of racial tension within Cleveland. It's still to this day one of the most segregated cities in the country. Basically, you live on the east side. It's the black side. The west side was the white side, right? But when the Huff riots are going on, the cops could not do a single thing about it. It was getting out of hand. You know who they called to negotiate with the riots leaders? Were the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were so respected in the Black community at the time that they could talk people down, and it worked, right? And the Huff riots ended because of the actions of the Panthers. Now, yeah, I know we have criticisms of the Panthers and this and that, but they did a lot of good, and people still remember them fondly because of that.
All right, that's pretty interesting. But
I thought this would be just puns, honestly.
all right, well, I know the Black Panthers in that circumstance really were honorable, but you can't always trust big cats because one might be a lion, or maybe another one is a cheetah.
All right, get him out of here, Daniel.
I actually got that one. I didn't get the turkey one.
It was a poultry, because turkey's poultry.
The meat. Yeah.
I'm gonna mute you.
Or
there you go. No, you were echoing for me, so I muted you on StreamYard. All right. Anyway, who do we have next, Daniel?
Hey guys, we've got Orange to give us a little update on the situation in Sudan.
Is there? Oh, there's new information, huh? What's up,
Yep.
Orange? Is there new information on Sudan that you have for us?
Oh.
Hey, what's up, Orange? How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good.
Excellent. Daniel says that you have an update on the situation ongoing in Sudan.
Yeah. There's one big thing, and I guess another, and some events on as far as the battle is concerned. The big thing is that there was recently a UK written resolution in the UN calling for a ceasefire, which Russia shut down. Russia was the only one on the Security Council who voted against it. And they were saying that this resolution is seeking to impose a solution into Sudan without the actual authority of the Sudanese government.
No, I mean, not wrong.
Yeah.
No, wrong at
it
all.
should also, yeah, and it's also worth mentioning that the UK has tried to suppress criticism of the UAE's role in Sudan.
Really? That's interesting. I thought that was like common knowledge.
At this point, I think it is. Let me pull up the article. I'll post it into the chat.
Perfect. That would be great. Thank you. All right. So you said there were some little things too, right?
Yeah, recently. This is more like personal, but since that commander and the RSF defected over to the army, the RSF has gone into Al Jazeera in what's been called like a revenge, where they've been looting and killing and emptying out villages.
Oh man.
Yeah. So recently, one of the villages where a lot of my actual family is they literally said, "Get on these buses, or we'll kill you."
Jesus Christ! I'm so sorry, brother. That's horrible.
Yeah.
I hope your family is okay and they're staying safe.
Yeah. I hope so too. Let me find the actual link.
All right. Well,
yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
They'll be in our thoughts for sure, brother.
Yeah. The
Right,
other thing is, because last time I wanted to mention a little bit, because I was a little bit hesitant about supporting the army.
Okay.
I guess for the purposes of like multipolarity, yes, you should support the army.
Sort of pragmatically, right?
Yeah. And also like as far as the war is concerned, I do too. The issue is that they're the ones who like initially allowed the RSF to get in this position in the first place. And they took several liberalizing measures over the last several decades, and they were in debt to the IMF. And to my knowledge, Iran is doing something very, very similar right now.
I'm not aware of Iran's relationship with them. Maybe that could be something we talk about next time. Unfortunately, we're running really, really short on time tonight.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your call, brother. We always look forward to your updates on Sudan, and I really, your family will be in my thoughts for sure.
Thanks.
All right, brother. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.
It's crazy to me that these kind of things happen all over the world, all the time. And we're sort of instructed by the powers that be not to even think about it. So I kind of like making sure we take a moment to really understand each of these situations as they go on. Anyway, Daniel, who do we have next?
Hey guys, we've got a new caller. Andre is calling us from Russia and wants to discuss some of the Soviet history, and actually some of it should tie into the Holodomor discussion from today.
Awesome. What's up, Andre? What do you got for us tonight?
Yeah, hello now. I've come with the point about some events in 1953.
Okay.
That later, in 80s and 90s, led to close interconnection with the current theme of Holodomor.
Okay, tell us your point.
So, I followed your Twitter quite a bit, and I noticed you sometimes call yourself a Stalinist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I definitely call myself a Stalinist.
Yes. And my point is that in 1953, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union fell victim to the Trotskyist coup. The Trotskyists of this time consisted of Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Suslov,
right,
and others from the company.
What your point is basically that Khrushchev in the secret speech basically like saying that everything Trotsky had been saying about Stalin all along was true, represents a victory for Trotskyism.
No, I mean that, well, if you compare the Khrushchev's secret speech and the Trotsky's papers, you will find suspicious amount of familiarities between their and Trotsky's points. Like they both say that Lenin actually wasn't a close friend of Stalin. They both say that Stalin was not a good administrator.
Yeah. No.
And other ones. Yeah.
Have you ever there's an American historiographer that we really, really like on the topic of Khrushchev specifically and the secret speech. His name's Grover Furr, and he wrote a book called Khrushchev Lied. And it goes point by point through every claim Khrushchev makes in the secret speech and proves how literally none of them are true. Like he lied in every single point he made in the secret speech. He even contradicts himself a couple times, by the way, which is ridiculous. But I think it's funny that Trotskyists specifically, and all kinds of anti-communists, not just Trots, suddenly
I'll say even more. Do you recall the Trotskyist concept of permanent revolution?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember the Trotskyist concept of permanent revolution?
Yes, I do.
And then, do you know how the Communist Party of China, of the Mao Zedong, called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union itself during the Khrushchev and Brezhnev periods.
Yeah. This whole social fascism and social imperialism theories, the three
Yeah,
worlds
social
theory, all
imperialism.
that. Yeah.
And then
I
recall that the Soviet Union was always taking part of the proxy wars with the United States in Africa, in South America, in Asia, establishing their friendly regimes. Don't you think it actually represents the Trotskyite concept of the permanent revolution, as they're bringing their so-called socialism and the bayonets to the other nations?
No, I don't think that represents permanent revolution. Aiding other countries in their attempt isn't the same as, Trotsky's exporting of revolution. And his whole thing was, look, the whole question of permanent revolution revolved around the question of the peasantry, which is something that we sort of got into earlier, and Trotsky's mechanistic view about the development of the proletariat, right? That you couldn't have socialism in one country, especially a country as backwards as Russia, right? The whole socialism in one country debate centered around whether or not the revolutionary potential of the peasantry would run out or not, basically. And so, yes, the Soviets were, helping South Africa fight against apartheid and for their freedom. Hell, they literally funded our Communist Party here. Without the Soviets and the KGB, the CPUSA never would have gotten off the ground. That's back in Lenin's day, right? I don't think
the Soviets actually.
I don't think any of this constitutes the permanent revolution, because the permanent revolution idea sort of relies on a cosmopolitan notion of internationalism rather than a Marxist one. So the Marxist view of a nation is that it's one particular sort of form of the universal society, right? So that you have all the.
Well, I can.
No,
I think I can tell you later, maybe on next shows, what the USSR, about the actual international spirit of the USSR, and how they use their secret forces.
Brother, I gotta interrupt you.
To invade.
I gotta interrupt you. So I was trying to finish my point,
but I
moved on to another point. But I want to just wrap up this permanent revolution thing. But I want to give Mac a chance to answer too, because he hasn't spoken.
Yeah, just before I talk, Noah, you should mute me on your end on Discord, or
I can do that.
Just so you don't have the echo.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Right,
okay.
Ahead. You're good.
Okay, you don't have echo anymore, right? Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, to me, permanent revolution seems to be a very historical idea in the context of the revolutions of the 1920s and whatever, with the German Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution, and Poland, and the people in Hungary, Kuhn, I think that was his surname, the revolutionary there, and the Germans also, they were all counting on the Soviet Union to sweep through Europe and connect with them. At that point, you could have this, uprising basically all through Europe, which would at that point extend to the rest of the world, I suppose. But in any case, that failed, right? So I'm not sure. Now, I didn't completely understand your argument, but this is basically, to me, that's what it seems. But obviously, as far as it continuing after Stalin and whatnot, or during Stalin, I don't think it's comparable. I don't think the conducting foreign policy and supporting your allies is. I think that's not a theoretical framework of permanent revolution theory.
Yeah, what I
it
was
seems
trying
pretty
to,
obvious to me.
yeah, what I was trying to say is that permanent revolution relied on an incorrect interpretation of Marxism, right? And a lack of understanding the dialectic of universal in particular, and to sort of just say something I say all the time to put a clear picture on it. In Marxism, the universal is not that which is not particular. The universal is instead that which arises in many particular forms, right? So the permanent revolution was this notion that it had to happen everywhere in the world all at once. And if it wasn't, they needed to be the spark that started that fire and forced it into existence, right? But socialism in one country relies on a more accurate reading of Marxism, and Marx in particular that understands that dialectic of universal and particular, that sees the Soviet Union as one particular form of socialism arising due to the historical context that it comes out of. And other countries have their own particular context that leads to their revolution. It's another form of the same universal process happening. I wish we could get deeper into this and the problems with Trotskyism, because I kind of think your comparison of Khrushchev to Trotsky and the parallels between the two is interesting, and I'd like to speak about it. But we're like so super behind on time tonight, so we're gonna have to call it right here, brother. But thank you so much for your call. I look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Awesome. Thank you, Andre. All right. That was cool. I think that's a neat parallel to make. Even if, theoretically it's not what I would say. But who do we got next, Daniel? Let's set him up and knock him down.
That's actually that's the last call for the night.
Oh, perfect. So you timed it properly without. Excellent.
Even better.
That's fantastic news. All right, everybody. Thank you so much to the callers. Thank you to Mac from RTSG for joining us. Thank you, everybody in the chat, etc. Mac, before we go, is there anything you want to plug? Anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I will use the opportunity, I suppose. Of course, RTSG_main on Twitter, RTSG_news. Those are our two main accounts. RTSG News is the only reliable source of news on the internet. So, of course, that's very valuable to follow. I guess Legitimate Targets is also decent by Jackson. And beyond that, obviously, our Twitter account is currently posting a lot of bangers, or a lot of truth nukes and whatnot, as they say. So obviously follow that. And of course our Substack, which admittedly has been a bit stagnant for the past month, but we have like a bunch of drafts. Basically the timings were off. Everyone started writing at one time, and now the drafts are all in the similar phase. So once we kind of finish up all of that, we'll have a bunch of them ready. And in the meantime, I'm probably going to write a thread on the Holodomor. I didn't have the time of that because I was on a conference in a different country for the last week, and yeah, that's probably going to be our bigger work in the following few days. So yeah, that's all for me. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for hosting me again. Of course, Noah, it's always a pleasure. We went over time kind of again, but I feel like there was a better. Yeah, I feel like there was a better attempt, at least on my end, to keep it brief.
I think here's the issue with me and Matt going over time on these things. We both have like a sort of love of the details that prove what we're trying to get across, and so getting like really deep into them is something that we can't call each other on because we're both having fun with it. So I apologize to people about that, but you do have all the information you need now and the actual facts and numbers for what actually happened in Ukraine in 1931 through 33.
Yeah, I guess that's the most important part of it at the end of the day.
I think what we should do next is Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because that's another one that keeps popping up from these dum-dums and neo-Nazis and all that kind of stuff. So I'd like to get into that one with you. That I think will be fun. Before we go though, Popers gifted a membership. Thank you so much, Popers. And this Gene Debs fan, thank you for the $5. Says droughts 1920 to 21 and 1931 to 33. Yeah, that's definitely a part of both of those, the Volga famine and the Holodomor. But anyway, thank you, Mac, for joining me. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everybody in the chat. We're going to go out the same way we always do. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.
Stand up, all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no right. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. Let no one build walls to divide us, walls of hatred nor walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. We'll live together or we'll die alone. In our world poisoned by exploitation, those who have taken, now they must give. And end the vanity of nations. We've but one earth on which to live. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. And so begins the final drama, in the streets and in the fields. We stand unbowed before their armor, we defy their guns and shields. When we fight, provoked by their